1968 by His Excellency George Taslim Olawale Elias. He was also the first president. After him, we have had various presidents. He was followed by Justice Michael Odesonya. He was the second president. After that was Professor M.A. Ajomo. Then we had Dr. Matthew Tawo Ungu, followed by Emeritus Professor I.O. Agbede, who might just be joining us on this webinar. I am the sixth president of the Society of International Law, and my name is Yinka Omorogbe. I will be moderating for this session, which I think will be really, really interesting and topical. We are all, at least I am looking forward to learning a lot. There have been a lot of seminars about the pandemic. I mean, it's something different. It's true to say that everyone alive now, no one alive now rather, has experienced anything like this. So we're always thinking about what to do right now and what will we do post-COVID. So it's a very, very important topic for us as international lawyers. And we're very, very happy that we have a really distinguished panel that's going to.
Hello. Hello.
Hi, sorry, did you not hear me at all?
We missed you about when you talked about the panel.
Okay. The topic for the webinar is Conversations in the New Normal, International Solidarity and Human Rights in the Pandemic. This has been tweaked a little bit by our first of our three distinguished speakers, and he's going to be talking about international solidarity and human rights in the pandemic in Africa. I must say that we're really honored to have these three very, very distinguished international lawyers with us, and we're doubly, triply honored by the fact that we're actually talking to people that are in totally different places. We're divided on different, we're on different continents. And I'd like to say that one of the good things that has come out of the pandemic is the awareness, the great awareness of the fact that we are not separated at all by distance. There's so much that we can do. So our three persons that will be speaking to us. The main speaker is Professor Obiora Chinedu Okafor, who is a professor of law and the inaugural chair in international law and transnational legal studies at the Osgood Hall Law School, York University, Toronto, Canada. He's also the United Nations independent expert on human rights and international law. He will be leading the discussion today. The second speaker is Professor Michelo Hansungule, Professor of Human Rights and Academic Coordinator for the LLM/MPhil for the Center for Human Rights of the University of Pretoria in South Africa. He's a commissioner under the International Commission of Jurists, ICJ. Our third speaker is in America, is coming in from Houston, Texas. This is Professor Thomas Clavin, Professor of Law, Thurgood Marshall School of Law, Houston, Texas. He has numerous publications to his credit, including a book that is on equitable sharing, distributing the benefits and detriments of democratic society. Very interestingly, he was the Green Party's candidate for Congress from Texas's 18th Congressional District. So we have a host of very distinguished people, and I'm sure that we will learn a lot from what we are going to what we're going to be told today. Obviously, we're going to have time for discussions, and I hope that the discussions will be really robust. I would just ask everyone to please mute their microphones. I'm not sure whether the host is taking charge of this, but please ensure that everyone's microphone is muted except the person that is going to speak. Finally, I'd like to just briefly thank Dr. Azubike, our Assistant Secretary, who has very ably put this whole workshop webinar together for us. Thank you very much. So, Dr. Obiaro Okafor, over to you. I hope you're ready. Prof.
Thank you, Prof. Thank you, everyone, and society, the Nigerian Society of International Law, for organizing this and for being here, for attending. It's my great honor and pleasure, although I'm here in Toronto, Canada. At this time, I am Nigerian, also a Nigerian academic, on and off. So it's really a pleasure to be invited to do this. I don't have too much time, so I'll dive straight into my discussion. I'm sharing the slides, and that'll be the basis for the discussion. So I'm going to talk about international solidarity and human rights in the pandemic, obviously the COVID-19 pandemic, with a slight bias to Africa. Bias to Africa in the sense that the points I make are global, but I have, if you like, Africanized them in certain respects because I am talking to an audience on that continent. All right. Sorry, I'm just gonna move that along. Okay, so this is the outline, sort of the way in which the conversation, at least from my end, to proceed. I'm just going to spend some time introducing the concept, principle, and you can see I put norm in brackets there with a question mark because there is a debate in terms of the concept, principle, norm of international solidarity in international law. And then I'm going to, because there's no time, do a brief illustration of how international solidarity can help improve the enjoyment of human rights. Indeed, it's imperative for the enjoyment of all human rights, but I'm just going to illustrate with two socioeconomic rights, and then end with what we can do during the pandemic that currently faces us, and because of the pandemic really, and as well as in the, I guess, aftermath of the pandemic. Excuse me. So let me begin with sort of the more conceptual, doctrinal part of the conversation. What do we understand by international solidarity, the definition? Well, I say briefly, because there's a lot, I can speak about this all day, but I'm going to go through, there's quite a lot that's been written about this, and I can't even begin to capture a small part of the time I have. But we do need a working definition. When I was first appointed, that's the first thing obviously that came to my mind, but happily, two independent experts before me have done that work. So as you see, I ended up adopting their working definition. Daniel Campanelli, who has done, one of the international lawyers, has done the most work on international solidarity, has told us that ideas about this concept, about really the pivotal importance of mutual cooperation between individuals and as among states, has been around for a long time, and not just in Europe. You can find concepts about inter-individual or intersubjective cooperation, solidarity in African, Buddhist, Islamic thought, all kinds of thought. Quite prominently, go back to the French Revolution's concept of fraternité, right? That's a fundamental political concept. It was a political concept at the time. Although, of course, the French National Assembly ends up passing it into law, in fact, compelling solidarity from the state, in this case, to every citizen in need of help. Later on, we'll see that the French Constitutional Court has expanded this recently in 2008. And because I'll come back to this, I won't dwell on that right now. For those who are sort of philosophers of the discipline, of international relations and to some extent international law. If you go back to Immanuel Kant's work on international solidarity in Western thought, you can see the beginnings of the notion of international solidarity as international, not just solidarity. Say in the French Revolution, it was solidarity among French citizens and from the state to the citizens. But in this case, this is international solidarity among the world's peoples and states. Begins to emerge from Kant's work, and not just his book on the his essay on perpetual peace. Now, it bears emphasis here that even in Kant's time, his notion of international, not domestic solidarity, but international solidarity, was not as an act of charity, but one of obligation. This is extremely important, and there I sort of name a few other people who have dwelt on this topic conceptually. Now, sort of in the realm of the UN, there's a lot of resolutions, declarations, treaties that contain either explicit or implicit expressions of the principle or concept or norm of international solidarity. And I'll just give you four of hundreds of examples. UN General Assembly Resolution 56151, solidarity as a fundamental value that requires equitable responsibility sharing in the refugee protection context, which is a soft law instrument. The 1974 Declaration on the New International Economic Order, Article 3B of the Convention to Combat Desertification, which is hard law. It expresses the principle of international solidarity as a guiding principle of that treaty. Part 11 of the Convention on the Law of the Sea, and also the UN Convention on Biodiversity. These are all last two are hard law as well. More closely sort of to the human rights field, Luis Baltazar dos Santos Alves, who is credited with first elaborating this concept in the context of the UN human rights system when he was on the UN subcommission, the defunct subcommission on human rights, which is now called the Advisory Committee. He refers to or defines this as a communion of responsibilities and interests between individuals, groups, nations, and states. Now, already you can see, I'll flag this later as well, that it's not state-centric. The notion of international solidarity, at least in the human rights system, is not a state-centric one. Also, the mandate of the UN independent expert on human rights and international solidarity, which I'm the current occupant, has a history of providing definitions. So the first expert, Rudy Mohammed Rizki, defines it in the way you can see on your slides as the union of interests, purpose, and actions among states and social cohesion between them based on the interdependence of states and other actors. This is important to preserve the order and very survival of international society and to achieve common goals that require international cooperation and collective action. Essentially, my immediate predecessor, Virginia Dandan of the Philippines, produced a draft UN Declaration on Human Rights and International Solidarity in 2017, which provides a very similar definition as Rizki's. You can see it there, and I have essentially adopted that definition more or less as my working definition. I've now been in this mandate for 3 years. So as I sort of said earlier, the definition of international solidarity is not a state-centric one. In other words, our focus includes international solidarity among peoples who live in different countries, among civil society groups, social movements, and so on, across international borders. Not just what states do, but what other actors and stakeholders do. All right. One interesting question everyone asks is whether it is the norm or the concept is one of international legal character. There's a debate here, there's a dispute here. First of all, let's get out of the way that almost everyone agrees that there is a moral obligation to show solidarity, right? So that will not detain us here. Cardoza and Kremer capture the state of affairs well when they say that the place of international solidarity remains somewhat uncertain in international law. It is uncertain to some extent, not completely uncertain. The reason I say this is, for example, Campanelli, who I mentioned earlier, has pointed to hard law provisions of international solidarity. So of course, these may be limited by topic, limited by field or subfield of international law, but there are expressions of international solidarity that are hard international law, that impose hard international obligations. Dr. Shyami Manasingh, who's with the Office of the High Commissioner, UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, has written a paper, and I agree with her, pointing out that even the UN Charter, if you do a combined reading of Articles 55 and 56 of the UN Charter, imposes an obligation of solidarity and cooperation, which is an aspect of solidarity, on states in order to promote the real and protect human rights. In the refugee protection field, there is a myriad number of both soft and international law documents that impose solidarity obligations, and those of you familiar with international refugee protection would understand that, about how to share the responsibility to protect refugees and so on. You need solidarity to do that. For example, if a refugee arrives at an Italian island, because of its geographical position, the EU has recognized, see Article 80 down there of the Treaty on the Function of the EU, that other European states, under the principle of solidarity, should take some of those refugees, even if they're located much more distant from the North African coast. I pointed out in the regional context, Cartagena Declaration of 1984, the OU Refugee Convention of 1969, and so on. Now, briefly, this is not international law, it's domestic law, but to go back briefly to the French Constitutional Court case, the Cédric Herrou case, here a French farmer was charged criminally for smuggling migrants. He was helping out migrants, wasn't charging them any money, but they were undocumented, and he was charged to court. The French Constitutional Court held that the charge was illegal because he was expressing solidarity. And in this sense, you can even call it international solidarity, because these are other humans that are not French. They are not from France, they're from other countries around the world. But anyway, the point is that the Constitutional Court held that under the principle of fraternité, solidarity is a constitutional principle and obligation on every French citizen, which is a very important decision that is also, in my mind, urged is a best practice. Much more specifically in the international human rights context, we can look at Article 28 of the UDH, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Everyone is entitled to a social and international order in which the rights and freedoms set forth in the declaration can be realized. A social and international order implies a duty. The creation of that order implies a duty of solidarity. One state cannot normally create that kind of order, in which social and international order in which the rights and freedoms set forth in the UDH can be fully realized. The International Covenant on Economic poses a duty of international assistance and cooperation on the states parties, about 180 of them, 78 or so of them, 178 states parties have this duty. It's a hard law obligation, albeit in the social and economic rights sphere. I've mentioned the UN Charter, more specifically to Africa. If you look at the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, Article 27, every individual actually has duties towards family, solidarity duties, towards society, towards the state, towards other legally recognized communities, and importantly for this talk, toward the international community. This is hard law. It's the African Charter. It's a binding treaty, right? So there is a notion of solidarity here. So when we think about COVID, and you think about your right to health and the duty of somebody else not to sneeze in your face, to wear a mask so that they don't transmit COVID to you, and so on. And you think about that duty being to the international community, it makes sense in the COVID pandemic, in any other viral or pandemic, actually. So there is a duty of solidarity there, I argue, which is not state-centric. Article 29 of the same African Charter also mandates duties on individuals to preserve and strengthen social and national solidarity. It's not international, but it's national. However, also talks about individuals' duty to contribute to African unity, right? So the idea here is that you have duties beyond yourself to other people nationally, but also to other Africans, right? Now, this is just a very sort of quick tour through because I don't have time, through sort of the definitional and normative issues that concern international solidarity in international law. Now I want us to move very quickly to how international solidarity can help improve the enjoyment of human rights, in particular. Two examples of socioeconomic rights during and post the pandemic, and of course with a slight twist to Africa. The discussions we just had on the African Charter, on the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, the UN Charter, the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, is a great segue to seeing the linkage that I'm talking about here, right? Between international solidarity and the improvement of the status of human rights around the world, on the African continent and in Nigeria. The key task is to outline the ways in which particular socioeconomic rights can depend crucially on international solidarity in improving their enjoyment. This has been recognized. It's not just coming from me as a scholar, but this has been recognized at the UN level by the UN Human Rights System, the then UN Commission on Human Rights, which has been replaced by the Human Rights Council, actually passed a resolution that clearly, as you can see, this is just one of a host of resolutions. One will be passed again this July, saying exactly the same thing, recognizing this linkage. But to be very specific, I'm just going to add, when I give a similar talk elsewhere, I had 5, 6 different rights to illustrate, but I don't have time. So I'm just going to illustrate to the right to health and the right to water, which are very important in the pandemic. More generally, everyone is aware of the argument that other states and other peoples need to assist, especially developing countries, if they're to develop, right? Also, and that includes, of course, getting working health systems, getting their health systems up to par. So Article 16 of the African Charter on the right to health can be improved. The enjoyment of that right can be improved through the enjoyment of international solidarity, and indeed cannot be improved adequately without international solidarity, especially in the pandemic. You can connect this to the right to development as well, which I try to do. And to bring it down to the pandemic, I want to again remind you of what former US Ambassador Samantha Power said recently, that the pandemic will not end for anyone unless it ends for everyone, right? This is not a disease that you can catch and you're treated and you get well and that's it for you. No, you can get well all you want, but as long as your neighbor doesn't get well, as long as the people in the neighboring country don't get well, as long as people anywhere in the world don't get well, you are still at risk of your right to health being not realized or not enjoying health, right? Because you still have that threat of the pandemic. I don't know if you all know about the recent flare-up again, a cluster in China, just again, in other places. So that's why the borders have been closed, because we are clearly at risk because of things that happen, the health conditions elsewhere, not necessarily even in our own countries. And so the connection to solidarity is very deep in the pandemic. But even without the pandemic, the connection to better health care, getting access to medicines that you need, that are not necessarily manufactured in the country you live. You all know about the whole struggle around AIDS drugs and patents, for instance, essential medicines and patents that happened about 10 years ago, right? So that would illustrate what I'm trying to say. Look at how in a health emergency, President Trump had an unproven treatment that he was advertising, which was hydroxychloroquine, but the US didn't have enough hydroxychloroquine. It was dependent on India for hydroxychloroquine. So it's not simply even about developed countries helping global South countries, but it can actually be the converse. So we're all dependent on each other. Here in Canada, we even had to get ventilators, even personal protective equipment from China, for instance, in order to combat the pandemic. Cuban doctors have done 18 missions just during this pandemic, many of them in African states. The right to water, what are the connections? What is the imperative of international solidarity in order to advance the enjoyment of the right to water? This is not a right that is, if you pick up a copy of the African Charter, you would see that is embossed on it, right? But as some of you who are human rights scholars would know, the African Commission on Human Rights in the Sudan case, COHRE, C-O-H-R-E case, read the right to water into the African Charter, right? So it is an integral part of the African Charter because of that. It is now explicitly guaranteed, other than the African Charter, in the African Charter on the Rights and Welfare of the Child, and also in the protocol to the African Charter on the rights of women in Africa as well. It is explicitly stated in those other African human rights treaties. Now, in terms of the linkage to international solidarity, you can imagine, for example, the dispute now between Egypt, Ethiopia, and to some extent the Sudan about sharing the waters of the Nile, right? That's one example that's not pandemic related. But before even the pandemic, Ethiopia wanted to build a dam upstream, and Egypt, that is far downstream, says, no, you can't, because if you do that, you're going to affect our right to water down here, right? So international solidarity, of course, is important. International cooperation is an aspect of solidarity, and that's important to working out how you share those waters by the riparian states. Countries that help cause global warming can actually cause your water supply to dry without doing anything, without coming to your country at all, without setting foot on your country. That's just the way the world's climate works, right? And if you're rivers and lakes and whatever streams dry up, you do not enjoy your right to water. So that's another connection about solidarity. With regard to the pandemic, you cannot fight the pandemic adequately without water. We are all told that the key thing is to wash our hands. What about communities that don't have water? So how do you get water to them? Don't have adequate water supplies. We're very familiar with that. We're talking about today. And so enjoying that right to water may require solidarity from other places, from other peoples, from other individuals. That's the connection with the right to water. So what then should we do? Because of the pandemic, during this pandemic, and in the aftermath of the pandemic, what might we do from the perspective of strengthening international solidarity so that we can strengthen human rights? Because it is something that strengthens human rights. That's my argument. The first thing to me, given my mandate, and I would confess to a little bias, it is my mandate to push for the adoption of this declaration. I've called on states, I've issued out a call on all states to immediately adopt the draft UN Declaration on Human Rights and International Solidarity, which makes all these connections that I've talked about, I'm talking about today, and implement, not just adopt, it also implements its vision of international solidarity, especially in the human rights field. Thankfully, Africa's delegations, including Nigeria's delegation at the UN, have long recognized the necessity for such a declaration. Have strongly supported my mandate, and even others before me. I think the time is now for them to champion the draft declaration's formal adoption at the Human Rights Council, and also at the General Assembly. First in America, so that it goes to General Assembly. This will help, if you ask why, but this will help to focus minds as sharply as is required on the necessity of practicing international solidarity in the struggle to realize all human rights for all. It will also provide an additional soft law resource to those who campaign for the international solidarity rights of others. It will do what any other document, instrument, or treaty does in these connections. Now, also taking solidarity or international solidarity much more seriously in the struggle for the enjoyment of human rights all over the world because of the pandemic, and during the pandemic, and immediately after the pandemic, will require much bolder measures, in my view, than the world has so far witnessed. And I'll just give you quickly a few examples of what we need. The pandemic may not, I'm not an epidemiologist, but it may not really end without a vaccine or an effective treatment. What if that treatment were to emerge today? What if one country were to develop the vaccine and then say, we're going to charge you $1,000 a pill? There are drugs that cost that, or $500 a pill, or $200 a pill. Does that make sense in a pandemic? Does that even make sense for that country itself? Because it might give the vaccine to all its citizens. That country will still not be safe from the pandemic, right? So it makes sense that any vaccine or treatment that is invented should be free, it should be open access, or at least it should be very affordable, and it should be widely distributed to everyone around the world. And the principle here, if that is done, is international solidarity. You may need to, I'm not a patent lawyer, but you may need to, if required, to modify national, international patent regimes in order to make this possible. I think this is already possible, but if required, this may need to happen. We also need structural reform because the pandemic, structural economic reform, pandemic has already, not will, has already devastated the global economy and the economy of most countries. Of course, the extent of the devastation is uneven. It's not, it hasn't devastated everyone in the same way. And the suffering, of course, will be much more in the poorer countries than in the richer ones, the already richer ones. But so we need structural economic reform. We also need serious national reforms. But again, my focus is on international law, which is what I study. So I won't talk about national reforms today. Some of those very quickly are reforms to stem the net outflow of finances and other resources from global south to global north countries. Yes, there is a net outflow of resources from the global south. Most people don't realize this, to the global north. More favorable terms of trade for global south countries, so that all this is geared to them getting the economies back up to speed, which will be even more devastated because of the pandemic. Some form of debt suspension has already happened. We need some measure of debt cancellation as well to allow many, not necessarily all countries, but many countries survive the economic downturn that this pandemic caused. Finally, I urge African states, I urge Nigeria, or all states, in fact, to champion the adoption and ratification of the draft UN Convention on the Right to Development, which is being negotiated in Geneva currently. One reason African states should be particular, or should care particularly about this, is that it has its origins in African thought, in the thought of jurists such as Doudou Thiam and Keba Mbaye, both Senegalese, by the way. Why should we adopt this draft declaration and champion it? We should, because an element of hard law is much needed to foster accountability, right? So we have MDGs, we have SDGs, but there's no accountability. There's no real accountability. So if we actually want to get things done, we need accountability. And one way of pushing accountability is to have a treaty that requires states. It will be the end of it, but it will help. All right. Thank you for your attention. I just had to go to give you sort of a quick outline of it because I only had 30 minutes. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Obi, for a wonderful presentation. Is Mr. President here?
Yes, hello, I'm there. Thank you so much. Thank you, Prof. That was excellent, and you packed so much into the little time that you had. I really don't know. I mean, I've gone around thinking about so many things, but I like the way you ended talking about the draft declaration, the Declaration of the Right to Development, because really that is the very beginning. It is something that we need. That is what is really going to help the actualization of rights such as the right to water, and I will add sanitation, and all the different SDGs. So I mean, and I think as well that you have given great meaning, great meaning to international solidarity, and how it can be made really practical. I'd ask host, can you please all Obiora, Azubike?
Yes.
Azubike?
Yes.
Please mute anybody. You're leaving too many.
Okay. I just muted everybody. Mr. President, can you unmute? I'll try to unmute you.
Okay, thank you. So
yeah.
Please just keep us muted, except we need to we need to talk. Like I said, it's excellent. I don't want to take time doing a recap. I know that Professor Okafor spoke excellently and took us through basically historically, starting with Fraternité all the way down, and dealt with the different laws, the soft law, the hard law, the UN, Universal Declaration of Human Rights that we all know, and then the African Charter. It's really good. Thank you very, very much. I would like Professor Hanson Gule to please speak to the topic from his perspective. I believe that Prof, you'll be talking from the perspective of some African Union initiatives, such as NEPAD and the African Peer Review Mechanism. Please, Prof, if you could go ahead now. Thank you.
Hello, Prof.
Professor Hanson Gule is who we need now.
Yeah. Its mic, it's muted, and I'm unmuting him from this end. Professor, can you hear us?
Has he answered?
Okay, yeah.
Do you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Madam President, for the invitation. Thank you very much. UN Special Rapporteur, my colleagues, Azubike, and the other coordinators. Once again, thank you for the invitation. My task has been made easier by the first presentation, which, as the chairperson has just mentioned, was quite extensive, and therefore I will try very much to merely pick one or two issues from the paper and add from here and there. What I want to say initially is that the principle of solidarity, for instance, here on the African continent, can be viewed in the context of the activities of the African Union. The African Union, being a continental organization, becomes the first expression for the exercise of the principle of solidarity. And also through the African Union, we see a lot of activities, as the President has mentioned, through NEPAD, through the African Peer Review Mechanism. We also see quite a number of others through sub-regional organizations like ECOWAS. There has been a lot of activities in that field, the SADC, COMESA, and many others. I want, therefore, to try and examine this principle of solidarity in the context of the African Union, but also in as far as the respect and promotion of human rights is concerned. So I want to say that international solidarity through the promotion and protection of human rights is really a recent phenomenon, which can be perhaps dated to the Second World War. As you know, prior to the Second World War, human rights was not considered an international domain. Human rights was considered purely as a matter for each individual state. So there was no international solidarity in the context of ensuring the protection of human rights.
I think he's right.
Do you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So now we see this shift from the emphasis on the nation to the international plane from the Second World War. And therefore, we say today, that human rights concern in one country is a matter of concern in another country. And it is in this respect that you see an architecture, an international architecture developing towards the protection and promotion of human rights, globally, regionally, and sub-regionally. more so, particularly during unprecedented times and situations such as we have at the moment. Since the pandemic, the outbreak of the pandemic, states globally have responded through various measures. And these measures have taken a toll on especially human rights protections, but also even on the democratic principles in many countries. And I want therefore to try and examine the principle of international solidarity through the outbreak of the pandemic and what it is that we've tried to do in trying to respond. For example, how have African states responded to the coronavirus and the COVID-19 pandemic? So in the African Union, for instance, states have come together under the principle of solidarity and taken quite a number of measures so far. And one of those measures that is clearly visible is the launch of a fund, a coronavirus fund. So this is the AU Coronavirus Fund, which has so far attracted more than $20 million to try and mobilize resources in order to increase the capacity of the African state to respond to the coronavirus and the crisis that follows. Also, in the African Union, current chairperson of the African Union, President Cyril Ramaphosa of South Africa, has issued a report in which he called on international cooperation, especially by cooperating partners, which is again invoking the principle of international solidarity, to try and wipe the interest rates payments on bilateral and multilateral debts owed to Africa in order to boost the capacity of the African state to respond. As you know, one of the problems and the challenges we faced in Africa was capacity. For example, testing capacity for coronavirus. So in the majority of African countries, we do not have sufficient resources to be able to mount effective testing exercises in various countries to know who is not well, who has contracted the coronavirus, and so on and so forth. So some of the figures that we are announcing are not really a reflection of the actual situation in many African countries due to lack of resources. Yet, Africa has a lot of resources. And one way in which we can mobilize these resources by looking at the interest rates payments, especially bilateral and multilateral interest rates. So the African Union has taken this position to appeal to the international community to exercise international solidarity in respect of African countries and give them some kind of time frame in which to not to insist on the payments of the debts which are owed. Related to that is the appeal in the same report for increased economic assistance to Africa. Increased economic assistance going to the same objective, namely to increase the capacity of African states. The third one is that Africa has tried to purchase nourgents from Europe, from developed countries, to purchase the various medicines from Europe, which may be assisting, although we have not yet found the cure, which may be of assistance in trying to generally provide assistance to the sick, to those who are not well. But it has been a problem because of limitations in many developed countries about purchases of medical supplies and medical products. Many of them are subjected to stringent restrictions. As a result, we are not able to purchase some of these. So these are just the two responses. The third response from the AU is the introduction of a guideline for the working place in Africa. AU COVID-19 working guidelines in Africa. In other words, to develop a framework for African states to use, to tap from, appropriate the standards to develop national standards on employment and the COVID-19, workplace and the COVID-19. Again, has been a response from the African Union, therefore expressing the principle of international solidarity, coming together as a continent. Now, the African Union, as you know, usually operates on the basis of sub-regional groupings. Therefore, there has been a lot of activities at the level of ECOWAS. In particular, in ECOWAS, they have developed capacity to provide technical and financial support to member states from their own resources. Of course, in addition to or besides international assistance. So ECOWAS has been very outstanding in this respect in trying to mobilize resources from itself to provide to member states to assist instead of waiting for resources from the West to boost the capacities of member states. In NEPAD, as well as the APRM, there has been studies leading to responses which were in the form of advice and guidance to the African Union, leading to what I've just been explaining about responses through the African Union. So NEPAD, as well as the African peer review mechanisms, have done intensive studies on what could be necessary to assist in developing, especially the capacities of African states to respond effectively to the coronavirus. However, I want to say this, that there are two major concerns that these responses have led to. And one of those major concerns is that some of the measures have resulted in catastrophic violations of human rights. I want to repeat, catastrophic violations of human rights. So the measures have not been consistent with protections of fundamental rights and freedoms. Number two, some of the measures introduced have violated democratic principles of governance. In other words, democratic principles of governance have been ignored under the guise that it is important to ensure introduction of measures to protect life, to ensure health care in the face of this coronavirus pandemic, which is very important. However, this has been done without regard to the international obligations that we have entered into, either through our national constitutions or through international law regarding respect for fundamental rights and freedoms and also democratic principles. I wanted to dedicate my discussion only to a particular group of people that have been, in my view, disproportionately affected: the migrants, the illegal immigrants, the refugees, the foreigners, the aliens, whatever terminology you'd like to mention to refer to them. This is a group which has been completely ignored in this desire to protect people from the ravages of the coronavirus. And I think it is important for me to zero in on this, even though I can make one or two comments on human rights in general. But in particular, human rights of this particular group, which I consider vulnerable group: migrants, asylum seekers, immigrants, illegal immigrants, refugees, foreigners, and aliens. And I want to say, Chairperson, that the first problem that has arising from this is that the majority of the measures make no mention, specific mention of the place in the measures of these people, how to ensure their rights during this period when we are introducing lockdowns, hard lockdowns, hybrid lockdowns, and so on and so forth. Very few countries have made provision specifically catering for those that are not their nationals. And this is a major problem. I want to say that owing to the squalid living conditions, living and working conditions of these people in the host countries, the squalid living and working conditions of these people in the host countries, usually they are also the most likely to be exposed to infection, to coronavirus infection. And yet, at the same time, there is no provision for them, catering for them in those countries, precisely because they are considered as foreigners. And that is a problem. Number two, specific mention should be made of domestic workers, you know, from one country to another. For instance, domestic workers from Zimbabwe who are trying to earn a living in countries like Botswana has been a big problem. One, because of their status. They are statusless in Botswana. And two, because of the nature of the work they do, domestic work. Now, as you know, domestic work usually is likely to give the particular worker a higher risk of exposure to infection due to that particular work. And there is no, in the measures introduced in Botswana and in various other countries, there are no specific references on how to address this in respect of them. Number three, due to stoppage of economic activities as a result of lockdowns, due to stoppage of economic activities as a result of lockdowns, many migrant workers with limited or no opportunities anymore in those foreign lands will be left without any incomes. And this is what has happened. Like the past 3 months have been extremely challenging for the majority of this category of people. There were no incomes, they were locked in the houses, and because they are foreigners, it becomes problematic for them to fend, to earn their living, to feed their families, and so on and so forth. Number four, their families and dependents at home in the countries where they come from are equally affected because of lockdown. Many of them depend on them, these few incomes that are externalized from host countries, they cease during lockdown. And that means families that have been left home will have to fend for themselves. A very, very difficult challenge for most of them. Number four, is it number 4 or 5? Businesses of migrant workers who often are not entitled to stimulus packages. For instance, here in South Africa, where I am, the government has announced a number of stimulus packages similar to the one announced in the US, probably much lower in terms of costs, for businesses to be assisted. Now, when you examine the stimulus package, it does not extend to foreign business owners, and that is a problem. And yet, the effect of a lockdown cuts across. It disregards the fact of your nationality, whether you're a foreigner or you are local. If you are running a small shop across the border, you will not be included. You are not likely to be included in the stimulus package, and that is a problem. Number 6, closures of borders automatically violate the principle of reforme. Normally in international law, a state is obliged to allow a fleeing refugee, a fleeing person trying to seek refuge in another country, protection in the country of refuge. But once you announce a closure of the border, automatically that means the right to seek refuge is violated. And we see that in the past 3 months, no one has spoken about the rights to refuge of the people that may be seeking refuge, how they should be catered for during this period. Number 7, I give a specific example of South Africa, for example, has announced a wide range of social security packages Now, there has been introduced some packages on child grant in South Africa has been increased for the past 3 months. People are going to get more money in their pockets for having children if they are not working. All the people that are not working, a new fund has been created to provide them with about 250 South African rand, roughly 25 US dollars, to support you. Very small amount, but something to support you. The point is that these measures do not apply or are not understood to apply to foreigners. And that is the problem. So the illegal immigrants, the migrants, the refugees are usually excluded in this respect. Number 7, cross-border trade, especially by women in Africa. You know how Africa is structured. The majority of traders, small traders, are women. They are the ones who are actually driving the international trade, intra-African international trade. But once you cross the borders, cross-border trade is immediately terminated. And then you have to think about what will be the incomes for these people. So that is a big problem, that there was no provision in the majority of the measures introduced to cater for this category of people. I also want to say, in terms of democracy, moving away now from rights, in terms of democracy, the announcements of lockdowns has been construed to mean suspension of parliamentary activities in many African countries. So parliamentary activities have ceased. Immediately, the executive announced the introduction of a lockdown, especially in countries that have introduced hard lockdowns. Hard lockdowns have meant that people will be confined in their houses, whether they are parliamentarians, representatives, they are not allowed to go to their parliaments. And that means that we have closed down the activities in the legislatures. So who is going to do the legislation for us during the lockdown? Normally, what has happened is that the executive has assumed the powers of the legislature during that period. The executive has assumed, abrogated the constitutional provisions by taking over the responsibility to legislate, and without anyone checking it, without anyone overseeing it. And that is a problem. So we see, for instance, in the case of South Africa, the establishment of the Coronavirus Council, Council, which is entirely comprised of the executive without the legislature. And that is a problem, because it means that there is no external mechanisms to monitor, to see the extent to which some of the measures introduced may be democratic. What about the judiciary? Judiciary is also in Africa, especially in respect of human rights concerns, have been closed. So the same lockdowns have ensured that the judiciary would not operate in the last 3 months. And that is a problem. There are only a few countries, a tiny bit of countries, in which the chief justices in those countries have asserted their powers, the powers of their constitutions, to insist that the judiciary will remain open, and that the decision to close or open the judiciary shall remain that of the chief justice. I have in mind a tiny country, the Eswatini, previously called Swaziland, where the chief justice asserted his authority and told the executive that they cannot close the judiciary. He will have to decide whether to close the judiciary or not. But in many other African countries, we see that an announcement from the executive of the lockdown has ipso facto, by that very fact, meant that also the activities in the judiciary, sometimes except for urgent cases, will also be closed. And that is a problem. That means, therefore, that the majority of victims of human rights abuses, such as what have just been discussed, may have no avenues to go to ventilate their feelings, to challenge some of the decisions from the executives, particularly even on unprecedented decisions on coronavirus. the impact of them on human rights may not be challenged. Now, this is what we see in the rest of Africa. I want to conclude, however, by saying that an exception has started recently in South Africa, even though even here, non-government organizations also considered themselves closed with the lockdowns. They also felt that they were closed. Until recently, however, when they began to rise up and to challenge some of the decisions. So we see in South Africa that some NGOs and some political parties have gone to the Constitutional Court to even challenge some of the declarations made by the Coronavirus Council to say they could be unconstitutional. They could constitute violations of human rights to the extent that the decisions may have been taken without taking into account the human rights obligations that are still binding. Of course, I want to say this, that normally, if you invoke an emergency legislation, then it would follow that you would have to derogate from the fundamental rights and freedoms. So the derogation principle would apply. South Africa decided to avoid invoking the emergency legislation. Thank you. South Africa decided to avoid invoking the emergency legislation precisely in order to run away from what follows, the obligations. Because if you invoke it, then it means you have to report to Parliament, then it means you have to report to the UN Secretary General in terms of Article 4 of the ICCPR. So rather, they invoked the Disaster Management Act and not the emergency legislation. But in many other countries, they have actually invoked the emergency legislation, but without following the length and breadth of those legislations, which require that you make some reports to external bodies for compliance. And then to say that under the African Charter, which the presenter of the main paper has elaborated upon, I think it is important for us to realize that the African Charter on Human and People's Rights is the only instrument we have which does not provide for derogation from the fundamental human rights guaranteed in the Charter. So the only way you can derogate from the fundamental rights in the Charter would be interpreted perhaps progressively through the clawback provisions of the Charter, because there is no external derogation clause. And I think that we should have also taken that into account, even as these states introduce lockdowns, which fundamentally derogate from the fundamental rights and freedoms. Thank you very much, Apis.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much, Prof, for your exposition and for your looking at this whole problem from an African perspective. I have to say that as I was listening to you, I couldn't help thinking that a lot of the problems that you were talking about, particularly having to do with the migrants and refugees and foreigners, are really the problems that the poor are facing, particularly the poor in countries where there is no stimulus package for them. It's really, I mean, the hardship during this period has been really, really untold for a lot of them. But it's good to find that there are different innovations that are taking place in the continent. And it's good to see that somehow the pandemic seems to have created a greater awareness of the need for solidarity amongst African nations. That is something that we definitely need. Thank you so much once again. I'd like to now turn over to Professor Tom Claven of the Thurgood Marshall School of Law. You're going to talk about this from the perspective of equitable distribution. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay. First of all, I just want to say what a great honor it is to be here today, and I thank you all for having me and inviting me to speak. Azubike asked me to speak about equitable sharing, and that's the title of a book that I published a few years ago. And in the book, I argued that a principle of equitable sharing is fundamental to what it means to be a democratic society, that a society could not legitimately claim to be democratic unless it was practicing equitable sharing. This is a concept which appears in international law as well, both explicitly and implicitly. Professor Okafor mentioned it in his talk today, and it's implicit in the notion of solidarity. So what I want to do is to say three things about equitable sharing. One is, what does it mean? The second is, why is it fundamental to what it means to be a democratic society? And the third is, how do we realize it in the real world? How do we bring it about? So first I'll talk about what equitable sharing means. Most generally, it means that all of the benefits and detriments of social life, all of the goods and bads, must be fairly distributed among all of society's members. If we're not doing that, we're not practicing equitable sharing. I'll talk a little bit more specifically about it. Equitable sharing does not necessarily mean total equality or total sameness. Sometimes, in fact, equitable sharing requires departing from total sameness. Sometimes it may require total equality, sometimes not. I'll give you an example of what I'm talking about. Suppose we're running a school and we provide to all of our students the same textbook. There's a sense in which we're treating them all equally because we're treating them all the same. But if one of our students is blind, this is highly inequitable from the perspective of that student, because that student will not be able to benefit from the educational process with the textbook that everyone else has. And therefore, to equitably share education, we must provide that student with a book in Braille. So I think it's better to look at equitable sharing, not in terms of equality, but in terms of how we respond to the differing needs and interests that people have. And so what I would say that equitable sharing is a principle of comparability or proportionality, that as a society, you must respond to the differing needs and interests of all of our people in a proportional way. And proportionality, I'm sure you all know, is also a key concept in international law. What the specifics of equitable sharing are in the context of the real world is highly debatable. This is what's happening in democratic societies all the time. We're debating what's the fairest way to treat the people of our country. Is healthcare, for example, in the United States, something that should be universal because everyone ought to be entitled to healthcare? These debates are going to go on for as long as democracy exists. But one thing I think we can fairly say is that we are not practicing equitable sharing in this world today. That's demonstrated by the gross inequalities within the world. You can't have 10 to 20 families that control half of the wealth of the world, which is the case, and satisfy equitable sharing. You can't have a small percentage of the world's population with such enormous wealth that they can't possibly spend it all on themselves, and that what they're able to do is to use their money to control other people's lives. You can't have a fairly small percentage of the people living middle to upper middle class lives while there are 2 billion people in the world that are living in poverty. That can't comply with equitable sharing. So, question is, so what? Why equitable sharing? Why is that required? Why is that fundamental in a democratic society? I can't rehearse totally today the argument that I make in my book about that, so I'll try to oversimplify it in a way that I think makes sense. The way I look at social life, the way I look at society is as a kind of a joint venture. People come together for the purpose of working together to produce more than they would be able to produce if they didn't work together, if they were isolated, if they were alone. That's the purpose of a joint venture. It's to come together and work together to produce something that benefits all of us and makes all of us better off. And if that's true, then in any joint venture, all of us have to shoulder our share of the obligations to make that joint venture work. And all of us are entitled to our fair share of the benefits of the joint venture. That's what underlies the reason why equitable sharing is required in a democratic society. And this joint venture that I'm talking about, although my book related mostly to the United States, is worldwide. It's worldwide because we now live in a world which is totally interdependent. There was a time when that wasn't the case. There was a time in history when what happened in one part of the world had very little significance, if any, to what's happening in other parts of the world. There was a time when people living in one part of the world didn't even know there were people living in other parts of the world. But that's not true today. Today, we live in a totally interdependent world. Everything that happens anywhere in the world has an impact throughout the entire world. And the coronavirus is an obvious example of that, as the two prior speakers noted. We have a disease which starts in one country, and now it's worldwide. The environmental crisis that the world is facing, the depletion of resources, global warming, the pollution that's affecting the entire world. These are problems that are worldwide problems. The expansion of the Sahara Desert, which is affecting the lives of many people in Africa, is a byproduct of the pollution that is being put forth in the industrialized nations of the world. And so we live in a totally interdependent world today. And what that means is that the entire world is a joint venture. And therefore, this concept of equitable sharing applies throughout the entire world. So the next question is, how do we realize it? How do we bring it about? And I want to focus on two points. First is what I call acceptance. We have to come to accept equitable sharing as something that we view as an obligation within our societies and internationally. If we don't accept it, then we won't put it into place. Once we accept it, then we have to have the mechanisms, the institutions to put equitable sharing in place. And that means we're talking about law and we're talking about governments. So acceptance and institutions are key to realizing equitable sharing. In the world today, in the real world today, we have severe obstacles to both of those, acceptance and institutions. The major barrier to accepting equitable sharing as an obligation that we all have are the great inequalities in this world. And the well-to-do and the well-to-do nations are likely to resist equitable sharing. Why? Because they fear that equitable sharing will mean less for them. And in fact, that's probably true, because we live in a world with 7 billion people. And it's not clear that it's possible that the resources are available to provide everyone in the world with what passes for a middle to upper middle class life in, let's say, the United States or Western Europe. In fact, I don't think it is possible. And therefore, I think that the world as a whole has got to change its outlook on what a quality of life means, that we have to become less materialistic, particularly in the West, and that we have to accept the fact that a world which is worth living in is probably going to require a more modest lifestyle for those who are now the haves, so that the great majority of the world, which are the have-nots right now, will be able to share equitably in what we produce as a world. And so I see this barrier to acceptance. And the question is, how do we overcome it? One is to try to convince the Western world that, and the developed nations, that equitable sharing is the right thing to do, that it's a moral obligation. And that's an important part of a movement towards equitable sharing. I've been writing recently about cultivating empathy. And I think that's a very important aspect of showing people what the right thing to do is and accepting equitable sharing. That we need institutions that promote equitable share, that promote empathy, so that people understand the need for solidarity with their fellow human beings. But just making a moral argument isn't enough. I think we must also, if we're going to gain acceptance to the notion of worldwide equitable sharing, particularly in the richer nations in the West, that we have to appeal to their self-interest. We have to get people to understand that their grandchildren, their children, they themselves, if they live for another 50 years, are likely to live in a world which is a very undesirable place to live in if we don't, starting now, solve our environmental problems, solve our developmental problems, and equitably share what we do in this world. That there will be conflicts, there will be diseases, there will be starvation, unless we do that, and that the Western nations, the developed nations, will not be able to totally isolate themselves from that. So we have to appeal to self-interest. Secondly, we have to develop the institutions to put equitable sharing into place. And we have obstacles there as well in the world of today. One of the obstacles, I think, is that equitable sharing probably requires a strong central government. That's certainly, I think, demonstrated in the United States. And we don't have that in the international context. We do have a world community. We do have international institutions which democratize, to some degree, the world community. But we don't have a strong central government. We don't have a world government. The main institution, worldwide institution we have is the United Nations. And my view is that as a long-term project, we should strengthen the United Nations, particularly the Security Council, so that the Security Council cannot just speak about equitable sharing, but can have the authority to help bring it about in the real world. I realize that's a tall order. The developed nations in this world, the United States being the prime example, are not about to cede their power to the United Nations Security Council. But as a long-term objective, I think that's what we have to do if we want to achieve equitable sharing throughout the entire world. In the short run, since we don't have that, we have to deal with the world as it is. And the way the international community, in terms of international norms and international law and institutions, works today is basically through bargaining among the nation states who enter into agreements, treaties, and sign on to those. And that's the process that we're going to have to use probably for the foreseeable future. The problem there is that when we're bargaining power becomes very important, because if one party has more bargaining power than the other, then the deal that's struck ends up favoring them. And we do have unequal bargaining power in the world today because the richer nations, and particularly nations like the United States, have enormous bargaining power when dealing with other nations. And somehow we have to address that. My view is that the best way to address it is what's actually going on in Africa right now, which is a solidarity movement to build African unity throughout the entire continent. Because once that happens, Africa will be able, in my view, or better able to bargain with the richer nations of this world in a more equal status, and therefore make more demands and reach agreements that are more equitable. I sometimes worry about Africa because of its vulnerability. Percentage-wise, Africa has a largely disproportionate share of the people in this world living in abject poverty. And I sometimes worry that if things get really bad in this world, folks living in the West would, if they could, try to isolate those problems in Africa and would be willing to accept horrendous devastation to the people of that continent. We can't allow that to happen. And I'm confident that we won't, because I'm confident that the movement for solidarity within Africa and African unity is progressing. This conference that we're having today is a part of that. And I'm confident that that will happen, and that we will, as time goes on, move in our world more towards equitable sharing. So I'm going to go overboard just a little bit of my final comments, and I'm going to say it this way. Africa.
Thank you very, very much.
Not quite finished. Not quite finished. Africa. This is my moral point I'm trying to make. Africa is, my perspective, the motherland. All humanity comes from Africa. Literally, everyone in the world is part of the same family. And mothers always love all their children. And so maybe Africa is not just the origin, the mother of all of us, but maybe as our mother, Africa is going to help lead us to a world where everyone benefits from the joint venture that this world community is. So that concludes my presentation, and I thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. An interesting presentation, and you ended up on quite a positive note, both on where you see what you see as Africa's role, and on the present movement, the solidarity movement to build African unity, which you see as very positive. Well, I'll open up the, for discussions. I mean, I thank the three of you. These have been great papers. I think I'll throw in my two questions first of all. And the first question I'm throwing in will go again to Professor Klavan. And I want to know what country, can you give me an example of a country where you see the principle of equitable sharing in operation? Because, I just wonder about that. And I just wonder about when we're talking about equitable sharing, whether we're not actually talking about something that is like an international minimum standard, or a national standard, or probably the baseline for maybe the SDGs. That is one question that I have. And then I have a second question for Professor Okafor, and that is to know the status, the current status of the draft UN declaration on human rights and international solidarity. I know there's some other questions. There's some other questions, but I'd be happy, maybe you can address these and then we can take up some of the other ones.
Okay, I'll start since you addressed it to me first. I don't think
yes, please.
This is Tom Clevin. I don't think there's any nation in the world that fully satisfies the principle of equitable sharing. In fact, since human beings will never achieve perfection, we will never fully achieve equitable sharing. What we have to try to do is to continue to move in that direction as far as we can. And I would say that some nations are doing better than others in that regard. Maybe the Scandinavian nations are examples of that. I don't think, though, that merely establishing a minimum standard of living is enough. That is part of what it is. At a minimum standard of living is required by equitable sharing. But if we're a rich nation, as the United States is, for example, just a basic minimum existence is not enough to satisfy equitable sharing. The more there is to go around, the more that has to be distributed among everybody in the society.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that. Professor Obiara, what's the status of the declaration? Professor Obiara, yeah, thank you.
Yes, thank you. The declaration was submitted to the Human Rights Council by my predecessor, who I must say prepared it, not me. So I give that credit to her, Ms. Virginia Dandan of the Philippines, in 2017. Because of the, as you all know, these UN organs are political bodies. Because of the political nature, it's almost like in the parliament when the chief whip counts the votes and you don't have enough votes, you don't table the sort of the legislation. So for some, as I was told later, it wasn't presented in a way in which it could be voted on at that session. It was tabled creatively as an annex to her report. So it hasn't been formally presented. So it hasn't been formally presented for adoption, but it is before them. But we're working on that. We first have to have the votes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you're working on acceptability, really? General acceptability?
Politically, yes. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. I think there are one or two questions for you. There's a question here for you. One of the participants is curious to hear more about the notion of solidarity and the Pan-Africanist nexus on the one hand, and the right to development on the other hand. As you presented as well, the challenge of implementation of the right to development on the other.
Mm-hmm.
So
well,
he's asked about the two. Yes, yeah.
Yes, thank you so much, Madam President. As Professor Cleven mentioned, Pan-Africanism is founded on the notion of solidarity, although not global necessarily, but solidarity among Africans, perhaps people of African descent. But I think that it's also a notion that could be expanded. And I think that that's a connection, a deep connection to solidarity. And that's why if you look at the OAU Charter, if you look at the constitutive instrument of the African Union, and most of our documents, solidarity tends to appear a lot because that's the basis on which some of these organizations were founded. So I think there's a deep nexus there. That doesn't mean there are no problems or bumps along the way. There are quite a few.
Okay.
In terms of the challenges of implementing solidarity, there are quite a few. I'll take it quickly, globally and then sort of more regionally in Africa. Globally, historically, the main challenge has basically been convincing richer countries, and Professor Cleven gave us a way of doing that, which is again to happen self-interest. So convincing the rich countries that they need to give up something. That's never easy, convincing anyone to give up something in order for someone else to develop. But I guess the argument has always been that everyone profits in the end. That's the main problem on the global scale. The challenge domestically is that notion, for example, Article 22 of the African Charter, which provides for the right to development, is now being applied by sub-state groups. So the OGIEC in Kenya, the two top cases are Kenyan actually, Endoros from Kenya, using it against African states as well, saying that your plan of national development does not apply to us. We want to, we want to have our grasslands and raise our cattle. We don't want you to give it to a large Saudi agro business to produce, mass-produce corn or something, right? So you see a clash between the vision of development at that local level, sub-state level of, say, the Maasai, the Endorois and Maasai people, and the national vision of what development means. So there are certain challenges. I can talk forever. This is my specialization, but let me leave it at that so I don't hog all the time.
Okay, well, just very briefly, somebody has a follow-up to this one and is asking about entitlements as a basis for solidarity. And I don't know whether this would be you. So it says entitlement to reparations as a basis for equitable sharing beyond the empathy. So I guess he's talking, Sylvia, yes, he's talking to Professor Claven. So entitlement to reparations.
Sure.
You see that as a basis for equitable sharing?
Absolutely. The reparations, the demand for reparations, which is a demand not just in the United States, but a demand throughout the world. The impact of slavery on African Americans, the impact of colonialism on Africa as a continent, both of those things demand reparations. That would be the first step towards equitable sharing, which is to compensation for I'll just say it this way, the past robbery that's occurred.
Okay.
Yes, absolutely. That has to be part of any movement towards equitable sharing in this world. That should probably be
the first thing. Thank you very much. Somebody asks what could have been done to avoid the situations we read about Burundi. Who would I?
So I didn't quite get that question. It broke up a bit.
Somebody asks about Burundi, the situation we read about Burundi.
Okay.
And within the context of this topic, I am wondering,
if they could clarify a bit,
maybe,
what aspect of Burundi?
you
Is
might,
it the COVID situation there? Or?
Maybe he should, Dr. Bello Fadile, maybe you should unmute so he can clarify Azubike.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. He's unmuted, but I'm sure Professor Hanson Gule would have something to say about Burundi.
Yeah. Okay, Prof. That's why I was asking. Yeah, Prof. Yeah.
But Dr. Bello, you can go ahead and clarify so that the students would understand.
Clarify in like a minute. Dr. Bello.
Yes.
Okay.
Well, in the light of the COVID-19, there's a struggle between Burundi and the World Health Organization, whether there is or there is not. So in the context of African talking, the professor from South Africa was saying what can be done, what cannot be done. And then I can link that up all for Professor Okafor in view of the Human Rights Court, where we only have 9 states, 9 African states that signed the protocol allowing non-governmental, non-state actors and individuals to claim for violation of human rights. How can we have solidarity within Africa when only 9 states allow individual violation of human rights? So those are the 2 things I have. Thank you very much.
Okay. Okay. Do I go on that last one or somebody?
Yes, please. Yes, please, if you can. In like.
Thanks, Dr. Bello Fadile. That's an excellent question. I think the number 9 was quite small to begin with, but as you know, it's even less now. 3 have, I think, have either given notice of withdrawal of that basically consent declaration, or have actually withdrawn. So it's going to be like 6. So that's a good number. 6 out of 54 African countries would allow NGOs to approach the African court directly, which is what every robust court. The ECOWAS court is robust because NGOs can approach it directly. However, the Ogier case was brought by the African Commission, and it's a locus classicus, as we used to say in my student days in Nigeria. It's a very important case that broke barriers, that made it extremely important. So it was actually brought by the African Commission. So that's one way you can actually go to the African Commission, and if the African Commission, it makes it a bit longer, but if the African Commission rules and the state does not implement, which is quite often, I would say, you can then apply for the African Commission to take that case itself to the court. And so there are ways to get around that, but I agree with you entirely, that's problematic.
Thank you. Thank you very much. There's a question here about can any member of the panel address the issue of police and other security agencies' brutality in enforcing the lockdown in many African countries, and what role the AU or the UN HCR, I guess, can play in checking this? Because there was quite a lot of police brutality. What role do you think the the African Union or international agencies can
I
play?
can say a word. I don't want to monopolize the answer.
Madam President,
Yes.
excuse me.
Yeah, I go ahead or?
Please go. Yes, please.
Okay. Just very quickly, one immediate and longer term. Immediately, you can approach the relevant special rapporteur, for example, the ones on peaceful assembly, and things like that, arbitrary detention, if it's a woman, for example, that's involved, violence against women, and so on, you can write them immediately. It's on the website, and they will respond. They've been responding to such abuses in many countries. They will respond. One has been issued on India, I think even Burundi. Anyway, if you approach them, they will respond. They will write the country concerned, and they will raise those issues to put pressure on them, and it will be publicized. More long term, you can also contribute during the Universal Periodic Review of that country.
Okay. So individuals can write, or NGOs?
Yes, to the special rapporteur.
Either.
Individuals can write to special rapporteurs. Yes, yes.
Okay, okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. I think these are the questions that I have here, unless there are any other. One question, by the way, asks about the female, thinking there was a female on the panel. Yes, there is this female that's talking. I hope my voice isn't too deep. The moderator is the one who's female. So that's the answer to that other question. I don't know if there are any more questions that, these are all the ones I have here, but I will say we have had a very productive time. I'd like to thank everybody. Everybody. There is still one question, right? Or is it a comment from somebody? This is a comment, I think. Pan-African solidarity needs to go back to its roots. In traditional pre-colonial African systems, we did have a higher level of gender solidarity. So when we talk about solidarity, we need to remember that we cannot move forward if we do not have our women involved as equal participants. For example, let us start making sure that panels like this wonderful one do have a woman speaker, not only as a moderator. African women know stuff too. That is true, but don't assume moderators don't know. Even if they're not talking, that is true. I will accept your comment, but I think we need to talk on this because I personally do not believe in that utopian view of gender solidarity in pre-colonial Africa. But that's neither here nor there. Then, of course, somebody says the lack of equitable sharing is really posing lots of negative impact in the world and regional affairs. This had its bedrock from individuals, leaders, and states' inability to rule selflessly, comparative cost advantages of states, and some form of ideological issues. This is quite an intractable problem to the realization of practical fair sharing. Going forward, we can only be hopeful that the recommendations are put in practice, that the nature of man's reaction in pursuit of diverse interests are carried out ethically and morally, which is very nice. Thank you very, very much. I think we have like 1-2 minutes. I see that Professor Akinteriwa would like to say something for a minute or two. Professor Akinteriwa is Vice President 1 of the society. I also want to look and Professor Akinteriwa, and I think Abdul Baki. So if we can talk, 1 minute each, so that at least we can finish by 7 o'clock. Prof, please, over to you.
Thank you, Madam President. I would like to ask this question. Shouldn't we be talking about quasi-equitable sharing rather than equitable sharing? Because the president herself asked the question, which country operates equitable sharing in the world? And the explanation is that everything is political, it's not moving forward. So we should be talking about quasi-equitable sharing. Secondly, I would like to find out how international solidarity in terms of equitable sharing applies at the level of the UN veto. Can there be any fair sharing, especially in light of the fact that Article 108, 109 of the UN Charter requires consensus of opinion before the Charter can be reviewed. Conjecturally, I would like to ask for explanation on international solidarity in the context of Hong Kong, because sooner than later, we are going to have a situation of serious misunderstanding between China with the international solidarity.
Yeah. Hello.
Yeah. Is that directed to me? Or I'm not sure. Or Cleven? I wasn't sure.
I'd say to any of you.
Yeah, I think that for me, I would conceptually separate aspiration and reality, right? So on the one hand, there may not be any country that currently practices equitable responsibility sharing or equitable sharing in the ideal sense that we would like, but that does not stop us from continuing to aspire, right, to it as our goal. There is no country either that practices human rights to the fullest. It doesn't stop us from aspiring for human rights, right? So that's where I look at it. I think that if it's conceptually desirable, we should continue to struggle for it, even if it doesn't seem realistic. This mandate, for example, that I hold has been around for 15 years. There are a lot of countries didn't see what solidarity had to do with human rights. After the pandemic, it came immediately, right? So it seemed so surreal to them, at 15 years ago. But now everybody gets it. Solidarity is everywhere. Even countries that used to vote against the mandate are now speaking the language of solidarity, right? So I think we must continue to dream.
Okay, thank you very much. There's a question on vaccines that I missed. Somebody asked, how can international solidarity be brought to bear on the issue of vaccines that will be most needed for this pandemic? Knowing how difficult and controversial this can be, especially if the person has directed it to you.
Yes. No, I actually don't think it's as controversial as it was before that whole struggle in the WTO around flexibilities for essential medicines, right? And post the pandemic. I think that it's already been actually mooted, not muted, in circles that you'll be surprised that China has already said, if we get the vaccine first, we are going to send it to everyone in Africa free, as we speak, even without negotiation, even without more, right? And so I don't think, I'm actually quite hopeful. This is a hopeful moment for me as somebody who works on international solidarity. So I think that with vaccines, I think the problem going to be rolled out. Who will get it first, right? And how fast? Yeah, is it going to be rolled out? I think that's where logistics will be more of the problem for me, not conceptually. Yeah.
Thank you very much. There's also a question here, Professor Cleven. Is there a responsibility component to equity in this conversation, or is it just about benefits? So do responsibilities come in?
Sure, of course. In any joint venture, all of us have an obligation to do our fair share of the work and shoulder our share of the responsibilities. That's exactly why we're entitled to a fair share of the benefits of what we produce as a result of our joint venture. The point I make frequently about the United States is that over the last 40 years, the United States has grown wealthier, much wealthier. But all that money has gone into the pockets of a very few number of people, not because they did all the work, but because all of us as a society made the society wealthier, and that money has not been fairly distributed among the people of this country.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I think, Professor Momodu, did you want to talk? Your hand was up one time. Hello? Hello? Okay, well, whilst waiting, there is a comment. Again, this goes back to women. This is, somebody says, we as African women are not fighting our brothers. We're advocating for working together in solidarity, in knowledge creation, knowledge discussion, and knowledge dissemination. Symbolic representation of women as knowers of knowledge is important for a younger generation. I couldn't agree more with that. Thank you very much. I hope I've got most of the questions. Hello, Prof. Dr. Azubike.
Yes, I think so. Maybe at the executive level, we might have to.
No, Dr. Abdulbaki, because I want to end at 7.
Okay.
Dr. Abdulbaki, Abdulbaki has a hand up.
Yeah.
Wants to say something? Okay.
Thank you very much, Ma. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay. I was going to ask that Professor Okoro mentioned something about the draft UN convention, and I want to be guided as to is there any way civil society and individuals in their personal capacity can lend support to promote the draft declaration on development?
Yes, thank you. That question has come up. How can we help is what some people are asking. How can we help? And I think I'll add again, add to that, how do we make international solidarity a component of international responsibility? Okay.
Okay. In terms of how can we help? Thank you. Thank you, first of all, for being minded to help. In terms of how you can help by putting some pressure by writing to your own missions, country missions. In some sense, for most of you, you would just be commending them for job well done, because they already support. Unfortunately, it's just a couple of Asian countries and mostly European countries who don't. Not all the European countries, but in terms of those who don't support, they're mostly in Europe. But you can also, liaise with civil society over there. I do have a lot of European civil society support, for instance. So just to talk and convince them, especially in this COVID-19 pandemic moment, how important solidarity is. So that's how to help.
Thank you.
If you go on the website, Google Human Rights and International Solidarity or Google me, there's also a mandate email address, and you can sign up to be, if you're from civil society, to sort of receive information. The second one, quickly, thank you so much, Professor Akinterenwa. Yes, it is already, if you look at the draft declaration, and maybe I should have shared it as well, it is an element of it. In fact, in the draft declaration and also in the African Charter, the way the solidarity duties are framed tend to be actually as duties, right? Which is responsibility. So that the link between the two is already recognized. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. Hello. I think we're nearing the end. Maybe the speakers, the presenters might want to say one or two things. Some people want some paperwork. So if you can share, give us a declaration, we can share the participants, I'm sure. And any other papers you want, Professor Okafor. Professor Hans-Ule, Professor Cleven, have you anything you might say in like 1 minute, Professor Okafor? What advice, from you? Professor Cleven, maybe you might start.
Oh, I just want to say what a pleasure it's been to be here, and we just need to continue our work to build solidarity in this world.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. It has been a pleasure to have you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Professor.
Is it me, Okafor?
Yes.
Same here.
Yes,
just
thank you.
My great pleasure to be here and to announce publicly that I'm so impressed that I'm actually joining the Nigerian Society of International Law. I'm sure you'll be surprised that I'm not already a member, but I discovered that I wasn't, so I'm going to join. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Yeah. You remember, and again, we are honored to have you here. Thank you so much. Professor Hans-Ule, I hope you're still there.
Probably dropped out.
Prof, is he still there? I know he had a few connection problems.
I think
okay, well, or connection.
Professor Hans-Ule?
You're there, Prof?
I think he...
Okay, well, if he's not, again, we will convey our deep gratitude to him as well. We appreciate our panel deeply. And I have been honored to be your moderator. Azubike, thank you once more. I hand over to you to give your closing comments.
Okay.
Thank you to everybody for the nice comments you have put on the chat group as well. So, Dr. Azubike, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Madam President.
Hello.
It's been a wonderful period having this discussion. And for those who are not yet members of the Nigerian Society of International Law, the society stands for scholarship, it stands for capacity building, it stands for solidarity. And becoming a member is very simple. If you want to become a member, just drop your email in the chat room. You're going to be getting the membership form and you fill it. For I see a number of scholars, Nigerian-born scholars that are based outside Nigeria. Like Professor Okafor, you may as well pick the form.
Yes.
Identify with the society. I see Professor John Mark Iyi and a couple of others that are based in diaspora. So you're welcome to the Nigerian Society of International Law. And I see the comments from Professor Japa Dauni, a great mentor, and I'm sure that we'll go back at the executive level of the society and think about how we'll handle the issue of gender equality and equity in terms of presentation. So once I thank George. George is our administrative secretary at the society. He's been so wonderful towards coming up with this event. Thank you, Professor Kelvin. Thank you, Professor Hanson Gule. And thank you, Professor Okafor, for your time.
Thank you so much.
And thank you soon.
Thank you so much.
Everyone. Okay, bye.
We hope you'll be at our next webinar soon. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.